Before linking objects together in a parent-child hierarchy, there are a number of steps that we need to take to ensure predictable results, especially regarding rotations. If you skip these steps, then you may encounter some very difficult situations, such as getting to the point of animation and then realizing that your entire rig is unsuitable for the animation task. It's very important that you follow these steps. The first of them is to establish the position and orientation of the pivot points of all of the objects that will be animated. A pivot point is an anchor around which an object transforms. Position, rotation, and scale are calculated relative to the object's pivot. On the artist mannequin model, if I click on one of the objects, I see the axis tripod indicating the location and orientation of the object's pivot point. If I go to a transform tool such as Move, that makes it a little bit easier to see. The pivot point of this object is at the geometric center of the object. And if I try to rotate it, it's not going to rotate around the joint that I want it to. Let's take a look at that. I'll zoom in on that with the Z key, grab the rotate tool, and try to rotate that. And it certainly doesn't behave the way I want. So I'll undo that with Control Z. I want to move the pivot point to the center of this ball joint, and that's a sphere. So to move or rotate the pivot point, you want to go into Pivot Point Transform mode, and that's found in the Hierarchy panel within the Command panel. So select Hierarchy, and then in the Adjust Pivot Rollout, enable Effect Pivot Only. Now we can move the pivot point. We see that the pivot point is actually displayed as an additional axis tripod. And I can orbit around with Alt and middle mouse and take a look at that. So let's move that pivot point. Grab the Move tool, and now we see the Move gizmo superimposed over the pivot point. For precision, I want to move the pivot point to the center of the sphere. So let's make this easier to see by isolating the selected object. I'll click Isolate Selection, and then zoom in on the object in all the viewports. Click on Zoom Extents All Selected. And we can use the points on this sphere as a guide to manipulate the pivot point. And we'll do that in 2.5D mode. So go up to the snaps, and instead of 3D snaps, enable 2.5D snaps. And then right-click on any one of the magnet icons. In the grid and snap settings, we don't want to snap to grid points. We want to snap to vertex. Additionally, in the options, we can enable axis constraints, and then close the grid and snap settings dialog. If we want, we can increase the size of the transform gizmo using the keyboard shortcut, which is the equal sign on the alpha keyboard. Press that a couple of times. And as you hover your mouse over the pivot point in the front viewport, you'll see a yellow circle, and that means you're actually snapping to that pivot point. So click on that yellow circle and then drag over to the center of the sphere in that front viewport. And you can get in closer with Control Alt middle mouse and pan with the middle mouse and make sure that it's actually there. Likewise, we want to do the same in the top viewport. Let's get in really close there. Move that pivot point and snap it to the center vertex of the sphere in 2.5D mode. Okay, so we got that position now. We can turn off the snaps, and we can disable Effect Pivot Only, and also disable Isolate, and check our work. Switch over to the Rotate tool, and we can try rotating in this perspective view. Right-click in that view so we don't lose our selection. And now the object is rotating around the pivot point we want. Let's undo that with Control Z. However, the pivot point is not oriented correctly. And we can see that especially in the front view. And I'll back out a little bit with Control Alt and middle mouse. The Rotate gizmo will indicate the current orientation of the pivot point if the Rotate tool is operating in local reference coordinate space. So let's switch the coordinate space over to local. We're actually rotating around the pivot point itself. And we can see here that the pivot point is not aligned with the object. And it will be very difficult for us to animate this because the pivot point isn't properly aligned. And if we try to rotate around X, we're actually spinning around more than one axis. It's not immediately obvious now, but We'll take a look at that a little bit more deeply later. So I'll undo that. In the next movie, we'll look at how to orient the pivot point's rotation.